Japan's path to modernization was strikingly swift, going from a largely rural society closed off from the rest of the world to an industrial powerhouse, capable of standing up to the West and enforcing its will overseas. All this took place in the span of less than a century. This period of rapid progress can broadly be attributed to two major events, the first of which being the opening of Japan to greater contact with the West in 1854, and the second being the Meiji Restoration of 1868. I'm the Enlightened Edelweiss, and in this video, I will put forth the case that the Meiji Restoration was ultimately the more important of the two factors in the making of modern Japan. Before jumping into the analytical section of the video, it's important to set the stage and provide valuable context to the events being discussed. From the start of the 17th up until the mid-19th century, Japan was governed under a system known as the Tokugawa shogunate. This consisted of a multitude of largely autonomous domains with their own local governments. Among the leaders of these domains, the Tokugawa family was the most powerful and held the title of shogun, forming the central government to which the rest of the domains answered. Within this system, there was also the Emperor of Japan, which is arguably a somewhat misleading term, since during this period, the emperor held no real power or influence. He operated more so as a religious and ceremonial leader, comparable to figures like the Pope today. Following the Tokugawa's rise to power, the imperial family were treated more like a very luxurious set of prisoners in their own home, rather than powerful and significant individuals. During this period, Japan was quite closed off, however, not to the extent that many may imagine. While trade with the West was limited only to the Dutch, Japan maintained contact and trade with the East, receiving news of different cultures, technological advancements, and developments. Even so, while contact with the wider world was certainly not non-existent, it could hardly be called extensive. All this was about to change. In 1853, an American expedition under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry reached Japan. The expedition aimed to end Japan's era of isolation and open up trade with the West. They delivered this demand and returned a few months later, in 1854, for a response. Japan accepted the demands of the United States and at last opened its doors to the wider world. The opening up of Japan, however, was far from uncontroversial, and it prompted several different responses. Among these was a movement characterized by the slogan, Sono Joy, which translates to, respect the emperor, expel the barbarians. The movement believed that in order to truly respect the emperor, the foreigners needed to be expelled, and that the shogunate had lost its legitimacy due to its opening up of the country, and thereby its failure to respect the emperor. This ideology rose up against the shogunate, resulting in a bloody civil war, which concluded in 1868 with the shogunate's defeat and the restoration of the emperor to power. This event, known as the Meiji Restoration, brought a formal close to the reign of the Tokugawa shogunate, and marks the beginning of the Meiji period in Japan. The new Meiji government carried out a host of sweeping changes to nearly every aspect of the country's structure, ranging from education and clothing to the foundation of a constitution and bureaucratic government. It's important to keep this background in mind when proceeding to the next, more analytical portion of the video. When discussing the concept of modernity, this video will focus on three main factors that characterize the term. Those being the idolization of progress and advancement, the widespread use of advanced technology, and the presence of substantial literacy and education among the general population. To begin with, the first factor, the idolization of progress, is a rather broad aspect that requires a fundamental shift in the mindset of the population at large. For Japan, the creation of this mindset arose fundamentally due to the government's desire to compete with the West. The rapid growth of firms and private ventures in new and upcoming industries such as railways and mining are evidence of the growing competition as a result of capitalism. However, while this may at first glance be seen as solely a product of the opening up of Japan and competition with Western businesses, the situation is more nuanced. The Meiji government's role in promoting this capitalism and fostering industrial development should not be understated. From the 1870s onward, the government operated several model enterprises, hoping to champion industries such as mining, shipbuilding, glass, sugar, silk, engineering works, and much more. The national slogan during the Meiji period, Fukoku Kyohai, Rich Country, Strong Army, demonstrates the main objective of the new government, to transform the country into a power capable of competing with the West. We can further see this unrelenting drive toward progress in the Charter Oath, a document on which the Meiji regime was centrally based, which clearly states that evil customs of the past shall be broken off, and everything based upon the just laws of nature, showing a willingness to break with traditions that inhibit Japan's progression to modernization and embrace those that aid it. This is especially apparent when contrasted with the stark anti-foreigner rhetoric prevalent before the Restoration. We can therefore clearly see that the Meiji Restoration's shift to a progress-oriented mindset is apparent, forming the first key step towards modernization. Moving on to the second aspect of modernization, the widespread use of advanced technology. We can see this in the Meiji regime's campaign of rapid industrialization. Only a year after the Restoration, the first telegraph lines were built. By 1895, these stretched across 4,000 miles. Similarly, the first railroads were built in 1872, and by 1895 they spanned over 2,000 miles. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, the government fostered many new industries through the founding of model enterprises. While it is true that most of these enterprises lost money, they were still a resounding success in that they kick-started these industries, training the first generation of workers capable of operating the machinery needed for industrial development. Without the government's initiative, it's doubtful that many of these new and crucial industries would have appeared organically for quite some time. In addition, they also invested large sums of money into foreign specialists in order to fully understand and swiftly develop new technologies. While it is certainly true that the first steps towards industrialization were taken by the late Tokugawa shogunate, it was the new Meiji regime that truly recognized the importance of a drastic increase in its pace and successfully put this into practice. We can see a key example of this in the case of coal mining, which had an output of around 150,000 tons in the 1820s. This number increased to 400,000 tons in the 1860s, and even more drastically to 2,600,000 tons by 1890. Even so, the pace of industrialization was such that Japan was still dependent on importing coal in order to satisfy its needs. Thus, the Meiji regime's adoption of advanced technology can clearly be observed through its massive push toward industrialization. Coming finally to the last crucial step towards modernity, the presence of substantial literacy and education among the population. We can see that by the end of the Tokugawa period, there was certainly a basic level of literacy that existed among the population, yet an actual education was far more uncommon. This changed following the Meiji Restoration, with the establishment of a Ministry of Education in 1871. By 1872, a minimum of 4 years of schooling were made compulsory for all children, and several national schools and universities were opened. A central aspect as to why the Restoration proved to be a step towards modernization can be found in its approach to education. In 1869, Kido Takayoshi summarized this approach, stating that the strength and prosperity of a country lie in the strength and prosperity of the people. If ordinary people are held back by ignorance and poverty, the beautiful phrase imperial restoration has no meaning. The difference between the Meiji government and that of the Tokugawa shogunate was that the Tokugawa shogunate desired an ignorant population that couldn't interfere with their business, while the Meiji regime desired an educated population that would actively engage with and support their decisions. This alone makes the modernizing nature of the Meiji Restoration abundantly evident. However, numerous other markers of modernity in this period can also be seen as a product of the Meiji Restoration. Chief among these is the creation of Japan as a modern nation-state. The Meiji Restoration directly resulted in the dissolution of the Han system of autonomous domains and the establishment of a central government to control all of Japan. This process of nation-building went even further, as can be seen in the establishment of the Council of State as the highest authority in Japan, the westernization of government in 1885, and finally the adoption of a national constitution in 1889. Furthermore, the placement of the emperor at the center of society created a rallying point for all Japanese, contributing to the formation of a Japanese national identity, as opposed to the previously dominant regional identities. The introduction of conscription, while initially unpopular, eventually led to a heightened national consciousness. It also leads into the next point, that being the elimination of the class system. The fact that commoners were allowed in the army was a huge blow to the hierarchy that dominated Tokugawa society. The abolishing of other social classes, such as the samurai and the era, formed the basis for a more meritocratic society. This was emphasized by the lifting of class restrictions on occupations. Japan was modernized economically during the Meiji period as well, with the introduction of widespread tax reform that paid for Japan's industrialization. In conclusion, the Meiji Restoration was directly responsible for several of the country's modernizing ventures, which would have taken decades longer had the country been left to its own devices. Japan's rapid modernization under Meiji rule resulted in the adoption of a progress-oriented mindset, industrialization, education, centralization, the elimination of the class system, economic reform, and much more. It made it so that Japan went from being forced to bend to the West's will to achieving a decisive victory over the Russian Empire in 1905, and laying the foundations for further imperial expansion. While Japan's opening to wider contact with the West offered the seed for this modernization, the Meiji Restoration provided the necessary water and sunlight to turn that seed into a tree.